Hi, it's Grandma here, and I'm reading The Sign of the Beaver. In the last chapters that we saw, we found out that the Indian tribe was moving west to find new hunting ground. They wanted Matt to go with them, but Matt felt like he needed to stay behind in the cabin and wait for his father, although the Indians are concerned that his father isn't coming. He noticed that Etienne was looking at him with a new respect after he made the decision to stay in the cabin. And Etienne gave him the dog for companionship. He felt like the dog was too old to go on a big move, and it would give Matt company. Matt then gave Etienne his watch. Then the last chapter that we read, Matt is preparing the cabin for his family to come. He has made he's repaired chinking between the logs. He has made plates for his mother. He has dried food, and he has made a cradle for the baby and a doll for his sister. Chapter 24. Matt stood looking up at the sky over the clearing. "It's going to snow," he told the dog. "You can feel it, can't you?" The dog lifted its nose, testing the promise in the air. Matt reckoned he'd been lucky so far. The heavy snows had not come. There had been flurries, thin and swirling, sifting through the trees. Many mornings he'd waked to find a coating of white on the cabin roof, which would melt away under the noonday sun. Today seemed different. The sky was the color of his mother's pewter plate. The brown withered leaves of the oak tree hung motionless from the branches. 3 crows searched noisily among the dry corn stalks. A flock of small birds hopped nervously under the pines. "It's almost Christmas," he said out loud. He could not remember for sure how many weeks belonged to each month. Sometimes he was not certain that he'd remember to cut a notch every day. Each day was so like the day before, and Christmas Day, when it came, would not have anything to mark it from all the others. He tried to put out of his mind the thought of his mother's Christmas pudding. "We'd better get in extra firewood," he said, and the dog scrambled eagerly after him. Late in the day, the snow began, soundlessly, steadily. Before dark, it had laid a white blanket over the trees and the stumps in the cabin. When Matt and the dog went outside at bedtime, the chilly whiteness reached over his moccasins and closed around his bare ankles. They were both thankful to hurry inside again. Next morning, in the darkness of the cabin, there are no windows in the cabin, Matt made his way to the door. He could scarcely push it open. The bank of snow outside reached almost to the latch. He stared at it in alarm. Was he going to be a prisoner in his own cabin? With all his preparations, he had never thought of a shovel. His axe would be about as much use as a teaspoon. He set himself to hew a slab of firewood to make some sort of blade. By the time he dug a few feet of pathway, the sun was high. He stepped into a dazzling white world. Now at least he could make use of the snowshoes that hung in the cabin wall. Eagerly, he strapped his bindings about his legs and climbed up out of the narrow path he had dug. The snowshoes held him lightly. He stood poised on the snow like a duck on water. But with his first steps, he discovered he could not even waddle like a duck on land. The clumsy hoops got in each other's way, one of them forever getting trapped beneath the other. All at once, he got the knack of it, and he wanted to shout out loud. He tramped from one of his snares to another, waiting every few minutes for the dog, who floundered happily behind him. The snares were buried deep and empty. He set them higher, just in case some animal might venture out of its burrow. Then he tramped all the way to the pond for the sheer pleasure of it. Coming back through the woods, he marveled at his own tracks, like the claw prints of a giant bird. Suddenly he realized that he was happy, as he had never been in the weeks since Etienne had gone away. He was no longer afraid of the winter ahead. The snowshoes had set him free. The cabin was warm and welcoming. He melted snow in the kettle and made a tea of tips of hemlock. He shelled and crushed a handful of acorns and boiled them with a strip of pumpkin. Afterwards, for the first time in weeks, he took down Robinson Crusoe. Reading by the firelight, he felt drowsy and contented. Life on a warm island in the Pacific might be easier, but tonight, Matt thought he wouldn't for a moment have given up his snug cabin, buried in the snow. Chapter 25. 3 days later, snow threatened again, and Matt gathered a pile of firewood to dry inside. He had just carried in his third armful when he heard the dog barking frantically a short distance away. Matt found him standing on the bank of the creek, his feet braced, the ridge of hair standing up along his back. Something dark was moving along the frozen course of the stream. A huge shape, too large to be an animal, even a moose. Then he saw it was a man, dragging behind him some sort of sled. He didn't move like an Indian. As he watched, Matt made out a second, smaller shape, just coming into sight around the bend of the creek. He did not dare to shout for fear they would vanish like ghosts. He stood still, his heart pounding. Then finally he began to run. "Pa!" he choked. "Pa!" His father flung down the pack he carried. His arms went round Matt and held fast, though he could not manage to speak a word. Then Matt saw his mother, struggling to climb down from the sled. He bent and threw his arms around her. How small she seemed, even under the heavy cloak. Sarah came floundering through the snow in her father's footsteps and stood staring at him, her eyes bright under the woolen hood. She wasn't the child he remembered. Awkwardly, he put his arm around her and gave her a hug. Then they were all talking at once, trying to be heard over the fierce clamor of the dog. "Quiet!" Matt shouted at him. "This is my family. They've come. They're actually here." They pushed their way through the snow to the cabin, leaving the sled where it stood in the middle of the ice. Matt helped his mother over the doorstep. He could see she was scarcely able to stand, and he pulled a stool near the fire for her. She clung to him, her eyes on his face. Matt would hardly have recognized her. She was so thin and pale, with great shadows under her eyes. But those eyes were warm and shiny, and her smile was as beautiful as he remembered. "I was so bound we'd get here before Christmas," she panted. "I couldn't have borne it to let Christmas go by. Oh, Matt, you're safe." "It was typhus," his father explained. "We all took sick with it, and the fever was bad. Takes all the strength out of a body. Your ma took the worst. We ought to have waited longer till she was more fit, but she was dead set on starting. The river is most frozen shut. We had to wait at the trading post 3 weeks before anyone would risk carrying us. Then we had to get the sled made. But your ma, she kept pushing at us. She's a rare one, your ma." "I had to," she said, "thinking of you alone in this place." "It wasn't so bad," Matt said stoutly. "I wasn't alone all the time. I had the Indians." "Indians!" his mother gasped. "Are there Indians hereabouts?" "Pa said there would be," Sarah exclaimed, wide-eyed. "What are they like?" "Well, they're gone now," Matt said, "but they were my friends." Then he brought it out proudly. "I had an Indian brother." From the way they stared at him, he could see it was going to take a mighty lot of explaining before they could understand. He didn't suppose they ever would, truly. His father said nothing. He was looking soberly at the snowshoes propped against the wall, at the bow hanging over the door where the rifle should have been. Everywhere he looked, Matt realized he must see something the Indians had given him or had taught him how to make for himself. However, his father seemed to think there was no time now for questions. "We'd better unpack the sled," he said, "before it starts to snow again." Matt sprang to help. There was one question he had not dared to ask till he and his father were alone. The baby. Did you leave it behind? His father ran a hand over his beard. His eyes were troubled. The little one only lived 5 days, he answered. 'Twas a pitiful little thing, would never have made this journey. Just don't say aught to your ma. She still takes it hard. Matt promised. He wished he had somehow been able to hide the cradle before she noticed it. Standing in the snow, his father reached to put a hand on Matt's shoulder. You've done a grown man's job, son, he said. I'm right proud of you. Matt could not speak. It took his breath away to think that he might have gone with the Indians, that they might have come to an empty cabin and found that all his mother's fears had come true. He would never have heard the words his father had just spoken. This was how Etienne had felt, he knew, when he found his Manitou and became a hunter. As his father untied the bundles from the sledge, Matt lugged them into the cabin. Flour, molasses, a fine new kettle, warm bright quilts, and thanks be, new boots for him, and a woolen jacket and breeches. He felt richer than Robinson Crusoe with all that plunder from the sunken ship. Then he noted that his father had a new rifle, and presently he discovered, poking out from his mother's pack, his own old musket. He hadn't a doubt she had learned to use it and would have to had her family been threatened. He suspected that even Sarah, so grown up now, wouldn't have feared to pull the trigger if they'd been need to. Well, there'd be no more need of it now with 2 men to fend for them. Inside the cabin, Sarah was bustling capably about, unwrapping the pewter dishes, setting out the little whale oil lamp that had always stood on the table in Quincy. That's the funniest looking dog I ever saw, she said. It won't come near us. Oh, he's an Indian dog, Matt told her. He's suspicious of white folk. You wait. You'll get to like him. He couldn't get over how much older she looked, but still spunky. Her eyes were sparkling, and Matt suspected that for her the long journey had been an adventure. He would have made her a beau instead of a doll, and he would, too, the first chance he got. His mother had thrown off her cloak, and the fire had brought a bit of color into her cheeks. She was making a great show of coming home. If the cabin seemed rough and cramped after the pretty house she'd left behind, she never let on for a moment. She went about admiring everything, the drying ears of corn, the strings of pumpkin, the fine new wooden bowls he had carved. All this food, she marveled, and I've been feared you were starving. He was thankful now for the times he'd gone hungry to save what he could for their coming. There's jerky for supper, he told her. I tried not to eat too much of it. You can make a pretty fair stew with that and a little pumpkin. Some salt would sure help if you brought any. As he started out again, his mother stopped him, put her hands on his shoulders. Wait a minute, she said. I just want to look at you. She had to tip her head back to do it. You look different, Matt. You're almost as tall as your pa, and awful thin. You're so brown I would have taken you for an Indian. I almost was one, he said, giving her a quick hug to show he was joking. He hoped she'd never know how true it was. We're going to have neighbors, she said happily as she set the new kettle over the fire. A man and his wife have a claim not 5 miles from here. They're staying at the trading post till spring. We plan to share a pair of oxen. They say 3 other families are coming too. They're going to set up a mill. Before you know it, we'll have a town here, maybe even a school for you children. Neighbors. That was a thought that would take some getting used to. Matt supposed he ought to be pleased. Yes, of course he was pleased. It was just that he rather liked it as it was here in the forest. With all the gladness in him right now, you wouldn't think there'd be room for any other thought. But even now with his family here, their voices filling the long silence, with all his worries vanishing like smoke up the chimney, he suddenly thought of the Indians. He wished that Etienne and his grandfather could know that he had been right to stay, that his father had come as he had promised them, But the old man had been right too. More white men were coming. There would be a town right here on the land where the Indians had hunted the caribou and the beaver. If only he could be sure that the Indians had found a new hunting ground. Matt thrust his arms into his new jacket and went out again into the snow. Behind him, the cabin glowed warm and filled with life. Already steam was rising from the new kettle. He'd cooked one of his special stews for them for supper, and he wouldn't have to eat it alone. They would all sit together around the table, bow their heads while his father asked the blessing. Then he would tell them about Etienne. That was a good story. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned a lot about Indians and colonial America and survival. Bye-bye.